Hello, and welcome to HC2U Podcast, where we inform, enlighten, and entertain people about healthcare and healthcare needs through real people stories and expert knowledge. I am your host, Terry, and today we have guest Kelly. Welcome, and thank you for being on the podcast.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Kelly, and I have a daughter, Izzy, who is now 14 months old, who at 6 months old was diagnosed with Al-Kappa, which is a congenital heart defect called as anomalous left coronary artery from the pulmonary artery. Virtually, it's the pulmonary artery comes from the aorta, not the coronary artery, so her left ventricle was virtually dying because it wasn't getting oxygen-enriched blood. So a congenital heart defect is usually present at birth. The one that she has is usually diagnosed between 2 and 3 months. You can see it through rapid breathing, fatigue, lack of eating, those things. So we had taken her to the pediatrician, I would say weekly for the whole entire month of November before she was diagnosed, trying to figure out what was going on. She wasn't eating, she was lethargic, she had a weird breath, like breathing kind of thing, and it was like not a gasp, but it wasn't like, it was like a grunt kind of breath. She was losing weight. She just wasn't herself. So we were at the pediatrician weekly trying to figure out what was going on.
How old was she?
When we found her, she was 6 months old.
Okay.
She would sweat while she was eating. All of these different things that we were like, well, maybe she has the flu, maybe she has asthma, trying to figure out what's going on. We saw one of her pediatricians, and she was like, where's that breathing thing going on? But that was really all that was going on. We saw a different doctor the next week, and then we saw the same doctor the 2 weeks later. She still had the same breath, and she was like, what's going on? Why does she still have that? She did a breathing treatment on her, but that did not help. So she was like, something else is going on. She sent us to the hospital for a chest x-ray to rule out asthma, RSV, something bronchial in her lungs.
Right.
When we got there, we did the chest x-ray. They told us to wait to get the results. From that, the doctor called back and said that she had an enlarged heart cavity. I had no idea what was going on, sitting there with my 6-month-old all alone in the hospital. She called back and said we had to go straight to the ER. From the ER, they did like an echo, EKG, all of those things, and they determined that she had to be airlifted to a local children's hospital because the local hospital did not have a pediatric cardiologist to do anything with her.
So the airlift.
Mm-hmm.
Do you go?
I did.
You went with?
I did. That was put my big curl panties on and suck it up from my little girl because I don't do things like that. But the medic, the nurse, and the pilot were just amazing. You could just...
What's going through your head, all of this?
At that time, I really didn't think much. I was like, oh, okay, we'll go up to Hershey Children's Hospital, which is part of Penn State, and just we'll figure it out. She'll get fixed, and we'll just continue to thrive.
Right.
So the flight crew came. We got her all in the bed, and Izzy and her spunky self. I mean, it was in the middle of winter. It was December 3rd. They had her all covered up, all sorts of blankets around her in this on the gurney to go to the helicopter, and she was kicking off the blankets. She was like, no. She didn't want any of that. And the medic fell in love with her because how could you not? So we went, which was a trip itself. To drive, it's about an hour. It took us 12 minutes from when we took off to when we landed to get to the hospital. I learned that we were doing 200 miles an hour on the helicopter to get to the Children's Hospital. Once we landed, that's when everything kind of fell apart. Sorry. We landed on the helipad. I was escorted off. They went back to get her. When we went into the hospital, she aspirated because they put a CPAP machine on her to help with her breathing. Once she aspirated, I said something to the medic, and the medic kind of just monitored for a second, and her heart rate was going from like 160, 140, 120, and it just kept dropping. And as soon as I think he said 60, her heart rate was 60, he started CPR in the trauma bay. That was the most surreal, scary. I couldn't even tell you. It was like outer body experience, watching them cut off your baby's onesie and do CPR and just everything they had to do. And within 5 seconds, the whole entire trauma bay was full of doctors and nurses. I think there might have been 4 or 5 doctors in that room. There had to be at least a half a dozen nurses. You had respiratory therapists. You had, right behind me, I remember the pharmacist was dishing out all the medicine. You had someone at the podium at the computer documenting all of the medicines that was going in. They kept trying to get an estimated weight, and I kept saying, she's 7. I was like trying to tell them exactly how much she weighed. They didn't listen to me at all. But in that situation, just seeing everything, I was fully aware of how committed that staff was to saving my daughter's life. From the medic who started the CPR to the respiratory therapist who actually had to intubate her, to the doctor who came down who said, that's not far enough, put it in farther. And then I knew that she was going to be well taken care of. They were going to do everything they had to do to support her. I learned later that she was coded, I guess, for lack of a better word, for 7 minutes. So virtually she was out for 7 minutes. Now she still had breaths because she was intubated, but that was pretty scary. Then I find it funny because the chaplain came in, and I looked at him. I said, I don't need God like you're coming in here for God. Just because when you're in the trauma bay, you think of a chaplain as someone who is there to...
Yeah, it's like, you're a little premature here.
Correct. Yeah, I was, at that point, I was like, okay, we're going a little too far. And then we had to go up to the PICU, which is the Pediatric Intensive Care, and just to watch everybody around her to support her to get up to her room was amazing. I don't have any words of thanks. Lauren, who was the respiratory therapist, just bagged her, shuffled behind her bed, and just bagged her the entire trip up to the PICU, from the 1st floor up to the 4th floor of the Children's Hospital.
Okay. Some people listening to this might not know what bagging means.
So basically, she was intubated with a breathing tube, and because she wasn't hooked up to the ventilator to do the breathing for her, they basically take a bag and they puff the air into her lungs, just like you would CPR.
Right. When
you're breathing into the mouth for them, it was the same concept, just through the tube into her lungs.
Right. So she's standing there, just constantly doing that.
Yes, every couple of seconds.
Yeah, just to keep your baby going. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's some scary stuff.
It really was an out-of-body experience. My limbs were numb. I think the only person who saved me from falling apart was the the flight nurse. She came over to my side and just talked to me about everything that they were doing, what the doctor was doing, why he was putting so much, I say epi, like the, what is it called?
What are you stuck on?
A word, medicine that they stick in to make your heart continue.
Oh,
Epinephrine. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Like I think I heard that word more than I've ever heard it. Like they had her, so many drugs were put in her in the short 15 minutes, I swear, that we were in the trauma bay. But that doctor, you could see he was a tall man, and he just took command of that trauma bay, because at one point it was just so chaotic, and he goes, everybody stop. And they all she continued bag, but they needed to get it calm again, because they were so full of adrenaline,
right,
and trying to do everything they had to do. And it was just, looking back on it, the symphony of everybody working was amazing.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so when we got up to the PICU, I was not able to go in. I had to wait in the waiting room. Now, there was only one person allowed on the flight, and I was the only one there. So I virtually was, I want to say, 2 hours by myself, as my daughter was in the PICU by herself with the doctors and nurses, and I had no idea what was going on. All I know is that the transporter came with lots of blood, and he goes, I just saw her there. She's okay. That's what they kept saying. The surgeon was called. They realized that she had to go on ECMO, which I'm not quite sure exactly what the acronym stands for, but it's virtually a heart-lung machine.
Yeah.
So they bypass the heart, and they have this machine oxygenate the blood so her heart could rest.
Yes.
Her heart was in such failure that it needed to rest. It just needed to not have to do its job for a few hours so they could figure out what was going on. So I signed that paper, and of course the doctor's like, well, these are all of the things that could happen. And the first one was death. And I'm like, been there, done that. We don't need to go there again.
Right.
But they put her on the ECMO, and then they were able to do an echocardiogram and some more tests. The cardiologist then came out and said, look, it could be two things. It could be a virus that got to her heart, or we're pretty 75% to 100% sure that she has a congenital heart defect of Al Kappa. So they did all of that, got her on the ECMO, basically let her rest, and then with further testing, they were able to, blood work, and that kind of determined that it was not a virus, that it was the Al Kappa with the heart rhythm and everything else. They determined that. Finally, my mom came in the morning, I want to say about 5 o'clock. So I went over for her chest x-ray 5 o'clock the night before, flew to the hospital, and then about 5 in the morning I was able to go back to her room to see her. It was, you talk about surreal in the trauma bay, this was surreal again. Just, your baby has tubes coming out of their stomach, and they had to do a full zipper cut to open the chest to have the ECMO put on.
Right.
And all of that. And she was just so cold, because in order to save brain function, they have to keep her cold.
Yeah.
So they kept telling me, she's going to be cold, but she's okay. All of those things. But you didn't expect her fingers to be so cold. So we kind of went along. But what was going on was she was getting so much blood thinners to keep the machine clean from not clotting, because that would have been detrimental. The blood that they were putting in was so thin that they were having to pump more blood in that was able to stay inside, and more was getting lost.
Right.
So later that morning, the surgeon came and said, look, we need to correct this. It's not, time is not what she needs. Originally, they thought she just needed time to rest the heart and see what was going on. But he said, we don't need time. We need to correct this. We need to get the bleeding under control, and we need to just go. So I signed papers. And again, what's the first thing that could happen? Death.
Yep.
But I had done research on it as my 24-hour stint of being awake was now closed, and I was working on 36 hours. So my husband at that time had gotten to the hospital. He had his questions. I had them all answered. And then they took her down for her corrective surgery. The only concern he had was if the artery was too far away from the aorta, just getting it to the aorta, to stretch it to the aorta to have it fixed. And so when they had everything set up to have her transported to the OR, because the surgeon only has one OR that he uses because it's all set up for pediatric cardiology surgeries.
Right.
They had 2 anesthesiologists, 2 people who just took care of the ECMO. They had like 2 respiratory therapists. Like, this was, again, a symphony of people getting her just down to the ER. It was awesome to see. Again, just the people working together to do everything they had to do for my baby was awesome. So they said the surgery could be anywhere from 8 hours roughly. And so we had planned, okay, so we're going to do this, keep my mind busy on virtually other things than the surgery. So we went down, I tried to eat, tried to rest. I ended up being able to take a shower, which was awesome, not going to lie. And then it was only like 4 or 5 hours after, and the doctor came in. Now I'm sitting in the waiting room, and this man is very stoic. This is his second career as a pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon. Before that, he was an engineer. So he comes to the glass door of the waiting room with like this solemn face, and I'm just staring at him. And he stops at the door. He gets this big, huge grin on his face, and he comes walking in, and he goes, "Success." He's like, "We're done." And he goes, "Everything is good. She's just getting cleaned up. We're getting her back to the room." And he goes, "It was millimeters. Her artery was millimeters away from the aorta." It was crazy.
What's that feeling, that anticipation, the wait, and then he comes and says, everything is okay. What's that feeling for you then?
At that point, it was relief. Like, I don't have any other words besides just like this feeling of my shoulders could relax. My heart was back where it needed to be. My stomach was calm. Like, it was just like, I can't explain it besides it was like just that weight was done. And of course, there was also other things that she had to continue on to heal, but the corrective surgery was a success. So we had to take it step by step, and that's how my husband and I always departmentalized the whole situation.
Right.
Okay, so we have it figured out what happened. Now we have the surgery. Now she has to get off of the ECMO, the bypass machine. Then we had to get off the ventilator, and then we had to gain weight, and there was feedings and eating and all of these other things that had to happen in order to get released from the hospital. We were expecting a 2-month stay in the hospital. That's what they had originally told us in the beginning. So we were able to see her. She was all cleaned up. She still had the tubes, and she was all hooked up to like all of these medicines and wires and tubes, and she was just so fragile at that point. Like we didn't know where we could touch her. But the nurses were awesome in the beginning because she was on the ECMO and the breathing tube. She had 2 nurses with her, and they explained everything. Every bit of information I ever wanted between the doctors and the nurses and the cardiologists did it all. We had pictures drawn on her glass window. One of the doctors brought in a 3D heart to explain everything to us. That was great because as a teacher, I needed to know everything that I needed to do. So while we were in the hospital, they needed to wean her off of the ECMO, and they did that by noticing how her heart was trying to work around the ECMO. So the electric current, you could see, was starting to go a rhythm on its own. And then that would clue the doctor in that says, you know what, her heart is trying to do what it needs to do by itself. So that was the first step. So the doctor's like, hey, we're going to take her off of the ECMO. No, you're not. Yeah, we're going to. No, you're not. We are. Okay. Then she was taken off the ECMO in 4 days, which is amazing. Like she's just a warrior. Like everything about her was, the timelines were always a little bit ahead of what they thought it was going to be. The next step was getting off of the vent, which was interesting to me because when they do the breathing trials, they actually told me that they're trying to breathe through a straw. So think of like one of those little flexible straws that you can get. Like that's basically what she was breathing through when they were doing these tests to see if she would be able to breathe on her own. I said, well, if she can breathe through a straw, I'm sure she can just breathe through her regularly. So she passed those with flying colors. They were going to take her off of pull the air tube out. Now, there was one right there, just in case she would go into distress. But again, she got off of that, and it was like, the nurses said she was just like, thank God, I was done with that. And that happened a week later. So she was on the vent for 2 weeks, mostly because she needed to heal from the surgery, and she was on some major pain meds. So they wanted to keep her sedated and in a medically induced coma until that was mostly healed and they could wean her off of the fentanyl, basically is what she was on. After that, it was feeding. We had to get her eating again. So the speech therapist would come in and see if she was able to feed. We tried bottles. Oh, she was like, yeah, this isn't going to work. I nursed her. She was awesome with that. Unfortunately, we had to supplement that because, as I have learned, breast milk is only 20 calories per ounce. But for her to continue to grow and gain weight, which weight gain helps with heart function, she needed 27 calories per ounce. So, and also because eating for her children who, at least for Izzy, was an aerobic event. That's why a lot of times when you have a heart defect that you don't know about and you're eating, you sweat because your heart's having to do an aerobic workout just to eat, which is very interesting to me. Didn't know that. So she ended up having to have an NG tube, which is the feeding tube that goes through the nose into the stomach. Originally it started an NJ tube, which bypasses the stomach and goes right to the intestines. She was able to graduate from that within like a day, and they put it into the stomach, and then we went home with that because it was too much work for her to nurse or to bottle feed. We were having a hard time getting a bottle that she would like. But then it ended up, we don't think it was the bottle, we think it was the formula because she wasn't used to that. So we came home with the NG tube, and she had that, I want to say, about a week. And then when we had our follow-up appointment with the surgeon, she was eating from the bottle and was great. So they were able to pull the NG tube out, and then she's was feeding normally with the bottle from then.
When did you find out what the condition was?
The Alcapa?
Yeah.
We found that out the night that we were airlifted to the hospital. So December 3rd, December 4th is when we found out her specific congenital heart defect. There's tons of them, and we all know that congenital heart defects are 1 in 100 for children who have one. For her specific heart defect, it's 1 in 300,000. It's one of the most rare congenital heart defects that there are. The surgeon who did her surgery, she was his 8th Alcapa repair.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's not many. So some of the long-term things we have to monitor, we always have to go to the cardiologist. We have an echocardiogram to check for heart function. So they check to make sure the function, because hers is function. There's all sorts of heart defects. Some that work with the electromagnet of the heart. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's not electromagnet, I don't know. The electro whatever of the heart. Some is the function. Some is the veins and the holes and switching of arteries and all of those things. Hers is mostly the squeeze. So how her squeeze is pumping the blood to the heart and through the body. So she has an echocardiogram every single time she goes to the cardiologist. But they also found out that she has a mitral valve regurg. So the flap kind of is supposed to go flap and really strong as it opens and closes. When we first had hers, when she was first diagnosed with the first echocardiogram, it was kind of like, it was like a limp noodle trying to flap. So what that's trying to fix itself, it's still not closing the whole way. So she has a murmur because some of the blood is going back up into that valve. So it's not sealing to keep everything down. So some of it kind of comes back up. Sometimes kids will have to have surgery on that. If it's very damaged, they might have to go in and repair that. We're hoping that she doesn't, because that would just stink that she had to have a second surgery.
The echoes, she has to do that for the rest of her life.
Yeah, she's going to always be followed by a cardiologist. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. In the beginning, it was like every 2 to 3 weeks. We just saw her in May, and we didn't have to go back till September. So her function is pretty good. He said it was in the low normal range, which is awesome. I'll take it.
You guys finally got her home,
mm-hmm.
and then you had to turn around and go take her back to the hospital again.
We did take her back to the hospital 3 weeks after she was discharged. She ended up having RSV, which is that souped up cold respiratory, whatever, I don't even know what it stands for. But because she had her heart surgery so soon, it could have been detrimental again. So we took her to an RSV. If anybody kids have had RSV, it's a very quick kind of cold. I took her to the doctor. My other kids went for well visits or something, and I took her with, and I said, hey, could you just listen to her lungs? Because that's always a panic of mine. Can you listen to her heart? Can you listen to her lungs? Is her breathing too quick? Because that's one of the signs that I'm supposed to look for. So we're always at the pediatrician. He probably gets sick of me, but oh well. So we went to the pediatrician. He listened to her lungs, listened to her heart. She's great. I don't hear anything. I literally went home that night and she started to cough. Within 4 hours, she started to cough. So I let it go for a little bit because let's not panic too bad. But that was Friday. By Sunday morning, we were back at the Children's Hospital for the RSV. So not only did I have an airlift to the hospital, but then I got an ambulance ride with her to the hospital. I'm like, yay!
Way to put mom in panic mode twice.
True story, yes. And it's difficult on the whole family because I have 2 older sons at home with my husband, and he is a great father and he's a great husband, and I love him very much. But we joke around that he's the CFO of the family and I'm the CEO of the family. So when it comes to him having to wear both hats, he gets a little overwhelmed, which rightfully so. You know, I take care of all of the executives functioning of the house. So I think that's a little bit more worrisome for me, knowing that the Hershey Hospital is going to do everything they can for my daughter, but it's leaving the other two. I had a lot of guilt that month that we were in the hospital because I wanted to be both places. I know I had to be at the hospital with her because every day, multiple times a day, I had medical decisions that needed to be made. I first could not leave her side. I mean, I probably could have, and I know I was kicked out of the hospital a couple times, but I had a very hard time leaving her side. Even when I would come home, you know, to do my laundry, to spend time with the boys, to get a home cooked meal, it was always like, what time is it? What time is it? You know, and I never left her alone. There was always a family member at the hospital, but I had such mom guilt trying to be both places at once.
How did the boys? Were they freaking out or were they good
No.
through all of it?
My oldest, he's 14. I think in the beginning he had a really hard time because he just overheard conversations. So he didn't know exactly what was going on. My 4-year-old, at that point, he was just like, Mom's not here, okay. You know, and just kind of went with the flow. But you could tell he was, when I would come home, he was very clingy and wanted to be right there. Then I'd have to like sneak away to get back to the hospital. But since the RSV, she's been doing well. We haven't had any more respiratory issues. She's had like a fever here and there, a little virus that we just have to monitor just to make sure that it doesn't develop into anything more sick, because it really would be right back to the hospital. Her immune system is a little lower, so I try to expose her little by little to things. I'm not one of those severe germaphobes with her. I'm a little bit, but not over the top. Trying to give her a healthy immune system.
How's her development?
She's a little delayed for her gross motor. She does have physical therapy right now through the early intervention program in where we live. And I would say she's probably 2 to 3 months behind. So she's 14 months now, and at the beginning of July, she just started crawling. She's wants to walk, but she just really doesn't have the core strength nor the leg strength to do it independently yet. So we're working on developing her core strength, showing her ways to sit to help with that, and then doing the walking and the pulling herself up, those kind of independent skills. Eating, she's right on target. She loves to eat. Fine motor skills like picking up her food, blocks, playing with things, she's awesome. Communication, she's doing really well. She babbles a whole lot. So right now it's just the gross motor is delayed. But we're working on that.
That's good news.
Yes.
Is there, for new parents,
Mm-hmm.
is there a test or anything that they can do to help? Or is it just something that the parent has to just keep an eye on to see if there's any signs and symptoms of it? Because, you know, a lot of times with new parents, they freak out.
Yeah.
They have that first baby syndrome is what I like to call it. And they're like, oh my God, something. So without sending them into a freak panic, is there things that they should look out for?
Definitely. Things to look out for is crying, sweating while you're feeding them, irritability. Now, these are all things that could be a normal baby too. Some babies are just irritable. Some babies are just not happy babies. But I think it's all of them together is where you really need to think about, maybe I should talk to the pediatrician about what's going on. Pale skin. She was always clammy. Like I would try and take her temperature because I thought she would have a fever, but her temperature was always low than what it should have been. the poor feeding. She would only eat about an ounce or two at a time. Then she would sleep. Then she would take an ounce. Then she would sleep. It was a constant, eat, sleep, because she was just so tired. Rapid breathing, or what my daughter had was like a little when she was breathing. And then a lot of times things can be mistaken for colic just because the crying, the irritability, the poor feeding, I always say go with your gut. As a mom, you cannot be overly cautious because most babies, at least for Izzy, her blood oxygen levels were always in the high 90s. Some of the other congenital heart defects, that's a surefire sign, is when they have low oxygen levels. But because hers was only affecting the heart, everything else was getting oxygen-rich blood, it wouldn't matter because the blood was oxygenated. It was that left ventricle that was virtually dying because it wasn't getting the oxygen-rich blood. Some of the other things that I saw with Izzy in the car seat, she hated being in the car seat. I don't know if it was the angle she was at, if she just was so hot in it. A couple times I know, looking back, that she had probably 2 to 3 mini heart attacks, virtually because she would go lifeless and then she would get a little bit of blue around her lips. I mean, I would stimulate her and within a couple seconds she would wake back up. But looking back, I'm like, it's exactly what she has. And then the mom guilt comes in again. But I just want to educate people, what to look for. And if your gut says something is not right, fight for it. There are things that I look back and I'm like, I should have just been a little bit more verbal. Maybe I should have just been a little bit more demanding that they do more. But again, at your third child, you're like, maybe, maybe not. You can always cough it up to be something else. So go with your gut. I think that's the bottom line. When you think something's wrong, go with your gut. Fight for something. Even if it's the doctor's looking at you and laughing at you. Say, no, I want this. Just do it.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for coming on the podcast.
You're welcome.
Next week on the podcast, I'm going to have Jennifer from Interim. She's going to come on and talk about what Interim is, what they do, and give details about home health and all that goes with home health. So thanks again for coming on.
You're welcome.
And thank you, the listener, for listening to HC2U podcast. I would like to thank my guest again. And for free resources and materials with any topics you hear on the podcast, head on over to our Facebook page. Just search HC2U Podcast, all one word. You can find us on social media. Our Instagram is HC2U Podcast. Twitter is @care2_YOU. Our YouTube channel is HC2U